At 0530 hours on December 16, 1944, Obergefreiter Hans Müller pressed himself deeper into his frozen foxhole on the outskirts of Monschau, Germany, and watched the artillery shells arrive. For 2 years on the Eastern Front, he had learned to read artillery. The Russian shells came with warning. First, the distant thunder of guns, then the whistle growing louder, then the impacts, predictable patterns that gave you time to react, time to dive flat, time to live. This was different. The shells made almost no sound. They simply appeared overhead and detonated 30 feet above the ground with a sharp crack that turned the air itself into knives. Men around him were dying in their foxholes. Log-reinforced bunkers offered no protection. The fragments came straight down, penetrating cover that would stop conventional artillery. Müller had survived Stalingrad, Kursk, and the retreat across Ukraine. He understood artillery. But this weapon made no sense. The shells were exploding at the perfect height to kill maximum numbers of men, every single time, with no ranging shots, no adjustments, no pattern he could predict. He did not know that the Americans had just deployed a technology German scientists had declared impossible to build. He did not know that the shells falling around him contained miniature radar sets more sophisticated than anything in the German military arsenal. He did not know that each fuse cost just $18 to manufacture, and that American factories were producing 40,000 of them every single day. All Müller knew was that the rules of artillery had changed, and German soldiers were dying because of it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The weapon that was killing Hans Müller and thousands of German soldiers like him was called the VT fuse, short for variable time. The name was deliberately misleading, chosen to conceal the true nature of the technology. The fuse had nothing to do with variable timing. It was a proximity fuse, a shell that used radio waves to detect when it was near a target and detonate automatically at the optimal distance. The concept was simple. The execution was anything but. A miniature radio transmitter in the nose of the shell broadcast a signal. When that signal reflected off a nearby object, whether an aircraft or the ground itself, a receiver circuit detected the reflection and triggered the detonator. Near misses became kills. Artillery that had required thousands of shells to destroy a single aircraft now needed fewer than 300 rounds. Shells that had buried themselves harmlessly in the ground now detonated in the air above enemy positions, multiplying their lethality 5 to 10 times. The proximity fuse represented one of the 3 most critical technological developments of World War II, alongside radar and the MAR, atomic bomb. Unlike the atomic bomb, which was used exactly twice, proximity fuses were manufactured by the millions and deployed throughout both the Pacific and European theaters. Unlike radar, which both sides possessed in various forms, proximity fuses gave the Allies an advantage Germany and Japan never matched. The British began proximity fuse development in 1939. By 1940, British researchers at Pi Limited had working prototypes for unrotated projectiles, the British term for solid-fueled rockets. Rockets had relatively gentle acceleration compared to artillery shells, making them easier platforms for electronic components. But attempts to adapt British designs for high-velocity artillery consistently failed. The vacuum tubes shattered, the circuits broke, the fuses were unreliable. In August 1940, a British technical mission led by Henry Tizard arrived in the United States carrying a black metal deed box. Inside that box were circuit diagrams and prototypes representing Britain's most secret military technologies. Among those items were proximity fuse designs. The British hoped American industry could solve the manufacturing problems they could not overcome alone. The National Defense Research Committee assigned the proximity fuse project to Section T of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. Section T was led by Dr. Merle Tuve, a physicist who had helped develop the theoretical foundations for radar in the 1920s. Tuve understood that the core challenge was not conceptual but practical. Radio proximity fuses were simple in theory. A transmitter emits radio waves. When those waves reflect off a nearby target, a receiver detects the signal and triggers detonation. Simple concept. Extraordinarily difficult engineering. The first problem was acceleration. When fired from a 5-inch naval gun, an artillery shell accelerated to 2,800 feet per second in the length of the gun barrel. That created a setback force of 20,000 times the force of gravity. 20,000 G-forces applied instantaneously. Any electronic components inside the shell experienced crushing acceleration that turned ordinary vacuum tubes into glass powder and metal fragments. The second problem was rotation. The rifling grooves inside the gun barrel spun the shell at 25,000 revolutions per minute to stabilize its flight. Centrifugal forces at that rotation rate tore apart components that were not mechanically reinforced. The third problem was size. The fuse needed to fit inside the nose of a standard artillery shell. Space was measured in cubic inches. Every component had to be miniaturized beyond anything that existed in 1940 electronics. The fourth problem was reliability. The fuse needed safety mechanisms to prevent premature detonation. It needed to work in rain, fog, tropical heat, and Arctic cold. It needed to remain stable in storage for months. It needed to be simple enough that ordinary sailors could handle it without specialized training, and it needed to be cheap enough to manufacture by the millions. German scientists had been working on proximity fuses since the early 1930s. By 1944, they had explored more than 30 different designs, including acoustic fuses triggered by engine sounds, electrostatic field detection, and radio frequency systems. None worked reliably. In 1943, German engineers concluded that building a vacuum tube-based radio fuse for artillery shells was technologically impossible. The acceleration forces would destroy the tubes. The problem could not be solved with existing technology. Dr. Merle Tuve assembled a team of physicists and engineers and gave them an impossible deadline. The Navy needed working proximity fuses for 5-inch anti-aircraft guns as soon as physically possible. Japanese air power was destroying American ships in the Pacific. Without an effective anti-aircraft defense, the Navy could not operate against Japanese bases. Tuve's team had months, not years, to solve problems that had stumped British and German scientists for a decade. The team included some of the brightest minds in American physics. Richard Roberts and Henry Porter conducted experiments on circuit designs. Robert Broad worked on receiver sensitivity. Harry Diamond and Wilbur Hinman from the National Bureau of Standards developed fuse designs for rockets and bombs. Every member understood they were racing against time. American sailors were dying in the Pacific while they worked. The first breakthrough came from Lloyd Berkner, one of Tuve's engineers. Berkner developed a system using separate transmitter and receiver circuits instead of a combined transceiver. This simplified the electronics and made the system more reliable. But the vacuum tube problem remained unsolved. Standard vacuum tubes shattered under the fascia, acceleration forces of gunfire. The glass envelopes cracked, the filaments broke, the tube elements came loose and destroyed the circuits. The solution came from an unexpected source. Western Electric Company and Raytheon manufactured miniature vacuum tubes for hearing aids. Hearing aid tubes were already ruggedized for portable use. They were small, mechanically robust, and used relatively little power. Working with Tuve's specifications, Western Electric and Raytheon engineers modified hearing aid tube designs to survive artillery gun firing. They reinforced the glass envelopes. They redesigned the filament mounts. They tested the tubes by firing them from air cannons into solid blocks of wood, subjecting them to acceleration forces far exceeding what they would experience in actual combat. Most tubes failed. The engineers redesigned them, tested again, failed again, redesigned again. By January 1942, after months of iterative testing and redesign, they had vacuum tubes that survived 20,000 G-forces and 25,000 RPM spin rates. The tubes were tiny, barely larger than a rifle cartridge. Each proximity fuse required 5 of these miniature tubes, along with resistors, capacitors, a battery, a safety mechanism, and a detonator, all packed into a space smaller than a beer can and weighing less than 2 pounds. The battery system alone presented enormous challenges. Standard batteries could not withstand the firing shock. Engineers developed a reserve battery that was activated by the setback force of firing. A small glass ampule containing electrolyte would shatter when the shell was fired, activating the battery. The battery then powered the electronic circuits for the shell's flight. The safety mechanisms required equally innovative solutions. The fuse needed to remain completely inert during handling, transportation, and loading. It could not arm until the shell had travelled far enough from the gun to protect friendly forces. Engineers designed a complex system using mercury switches that required centrifugal force from the shell's rotation to close, combined with a timer that ensured at least 3/10 of a second elapsed after firing before the fuse could detonate. This meant the shell had to travel at least 750 feet from the gun before it became active. Even if a shell misfired and fell near the gun crew, it would remain harmless. In early August 1942, the Navy conducted the first live fire test in the Chesapeake Bay. The cruiser USS Cleveland fired at radio-controlled drone aircraft on August 12 during its shakedown cruise. The test was scheduled for 2 days. It ended after 1 day because all the drones were destroyed. The gun crews aboard Cleveland fired 4 shells. 3 drones were destroyed. Navy observers present at the test were astonished. The proximity fuses worked perfectly. For the first time in history, anti-aircraft gunners could reliably hit moving aerial targets without direct hits. The shells just needed to pass within 70 feet of the target, and the proximity fuse would detonate automatically, shredding the target with shrapnel. The improvement over time-fused shells was dramatic. Some Navy officers initially suspected the test had been rigged, but subsequent tests confirmed the initial findings. The proximity fuse represented a genuine breakthrough, but successful testing and combat deployment were very different things. Tuve's team needed to scale up from prototype production to mass manufacturing. By January 1943, Section T had moved from the Carnegie Institution to a much larger facility and been reorganized as the Applied Physics Laboratory under Johns Hopkins University, with Tuve as director. The project now involved 26 contractors and 10,000 workers. More than 100 American companies contributed to proximity fuse production, including General Electric, RCA, Raytheon, Sylvania, Westinghouse, Eastman Kodak, Zenith, Philco, and even Wurlitzer, the organ manufacturer. Each proximity fuse contained 130 miniaturized electronic components. Assembly required precision work. Workers at factories across America built these fuses without knowing what they were building. Security was absolute. The project had the same classification level as the Manhattan Project developing the atomic bomb. Workers who asked what the fuses were for were told only that they were critical to winning the war. Many workers never learned the truth until after the war ended. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, Ohio, became one of the largest proximity fuse manufacturers, producing 5.2 million units, roughly 24% of total wartime production. The company converted its barrel organ factory into a fuse assembly line. General Electric's Christmas tree lamp factory in Cleveland was retooled to produce miniature vacuum tubes. Eastman Kodak, RCA, and Sylvania joined the production effort. At peak production, American factories were manufacturing more than 100,000 proximity fuses per week. The fuses that cost $732 each in early 1942 cost just $18 each by 1945. That price reduction reflected improved manufacturing efficiency and the economies of scale that only American industry could achieve. In November 1942, the Navy shipped 5,000 proximity fuses to Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet received 4,500 of them, and began distributing them to ships operating in the Solomon Islands. But the fuses came with strict restrictions. They could only be used over open water where dud shells would sink to the ocean floor. If a fuse failed to detonate and fell on land, Japanese engineers might recover it and reverse engineer the technology. That risk was considered unacceptable. On January 5, 1943, those restrictions were put to the test. The light cruiser USS Helena was operating off Cape Hunter on the south coast of Guadalcanal when Japanese dive bombers attacked. After dropping their bombs, the aircraft pulled up and began climbing away. Lieutenant Red Cochran commanded Helena's aft 5-inch battery. He ordered his gun crews to fire 3 salvos with proximity-fused shells at the departing aircraft. The gun crews had minimal time to aim. The aircraft was already several thousand feet away and climbing fast. All 3 shells exploded in the air near the dive bomber. The aircraft disintegrated and fell into the ocean. Helena's crew had achieved the first confirmed kill of an enemy aircraft using a proximity-fused shell in combat. It was not a lucky hit. It was repeatable technology. Over the next 12 months, the effectiveness of proximity fuses in naval combat became undeniable. In 1943, Navy ships fired 9,128 proximity-fused rounds and destroyed 61 enemy aircraft. That was 1 kill for every 155 shells fired. The old-time fused shells required 508 rounds per kill. The proximity fuse was more than 3 times as effective, and this was just the beginning. As gun crews gained experience with the new fuses and fire control systems improved, the kill ratios got even better. By 1944, the number of proximity-fused rounds fired climbed to 32,826, accounting for hundreds of aircraft destroyed. During the Marianas Campaign, proximity-fused 5-inch shells provided critical air defense for carrier task forces operating deep in Japanese-controlled waters. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American ships equipped with proximity fuses shot down numerous Japanese aircraft attempting to attack the carriers. The Japanese naval aviators, among the most experienced in their fleet, found themselves unable to penetrate the defensive screen created by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. One Navy study concluded that for every enemy plane destroyed, 5-inch guns had previously needed to fire approximately 1,000 time-fused shells. With proximity fuses, that number dropped to about 250 shells per kill, a 4-fold improvement in effectiveness. On May 11, 1945, the destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley was on radar picket duty off Okinawa when more than 100 Japanese aircraft attacked in a coordinated strike. Hadley's 5-inch guns were equipped with proximity fuses. In 90 minutes of continuous combat, Hadley shot down 23 aircraft, setting an all-time U.S. Navy record for a single engagement. Every proximity-fused shell that came within 70 feet of a target detonated automatically, filling the sky with lethal shrapnel patterns that aircraft could not avoid. The nearby destroyer USS Evans accounted for 19 additional aircraft before being forced to retire. Together, the 2 destroyers shot down more than 40 enemy aircraft. Both ships received Presidential Unit citations for this action. The after-action report described the proximity fuse as indispensable, but while the Navy was using proximity fuses extensively in the Pacific, the Army was prohibited from using them over land in Europe. The restriction remained in place through 1943 and most of 1944. Army artillery officers knew proximity fuses existed. They had heard reports from the Pacific. They knew the technology worked. But Pentagon officials feared that even a single dud shell falling into German hands could compromise Allied air superiority. Germany had the most advanced scientific establishment of any Axis power. If German engineers reverse-engineered the proximity fuse, they might develop countermeasures that could blind Allied radar or create their own proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells that would devastate Allied bomber formations over Germany. The risk seemed too great. That calculation changed on June 12, 1944. Germany began launching V-1 cruise missiles at London. The Vone 2nd were jet-propelled flying bombs, pilotless aircraft packed with explosives and aimed at civilian targets. They flew low and fast, approaching speeds of 400 miles per hour. They were extremely difficult to intercept. Traditional anti-aircraft guns could rarely hit them because the Vone 2nd were too small and too fast for accurate time fusing. British fighter pilots tried to shoot them down or tip their wings to send them off course, but it was dangerous work, and many pilots died attempting it. The Vone 2nd killed tens of thousands of civilians and caused massive damage to London. The Pentagon authorized limited use of proximity fuses to defend London against the V-1 attacks on June 12, 1944. Initially, the fuses were restricted to 90mm anti-aircraft guns and British 3.7-inch guns positioned along the English coast where dud shells would fall into the ocean. The results were immediate and dramatic. In the first week of operations, British anti-aircraft guns destroyed 17% of incoming Vone 2nd. This was already better than the 24% success rate achieved with traditional methods, including fighter interceptions and anti-aircraft fire combined. But as gun crews gained experience with the new fuses and fire control radars improved, the success rate climbed steadily. By the end of the fourth week, proximity-fused shells were accounting for 79% of all Vone 2nd destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. By late August, after proximity fuses were widely deployed across the entire defensive belt, that percentage reached 74% of all incoming missiles. On some days, it reached 82%. The Germans launched 9,300 Vone 2nd at England between June and August. Without proximity fuses, the casualties and destruction would have been catastrophic. The proximity fuse had saved London from what could have been an even more devastating assault. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later called the proximity fuse potent against the small unmanned aircraft and credited it with preventing far greater loss of life. When V-1 attacks shifted to the port of Antwerp in September 1944, the restrictions on proximity fuse use over land loosened further. Antwerp was critical for supplying Allied armies advancing into Germany. Losing the port would cripple the Allied offensive. The Germans recognized Antwerp's strategic importance and redirected their remaining V-1 launchers to target the city and port facilities. Between October 1944 and March 1945, the Germans launched more than 8,000 Vone 2nd at Antwerp. British and American anti-aircraft units established defensive belts around the city. The British 11th Armoured Division defending Antwerp came under a particularly intense barrage in September that required emergency modifications to anti-aircraft fuses. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati worked around the clock to produce the specialized fuses needed. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill authorized a special flight of Lancaster bombers to transport the fuses from Cincinnati to Europe, demonstrating the critical importance attached to maintaining Antwerp's defenses. Once the modified proximity fuses were deployed, a single anti-aircraft unit in Antwerp destroyed 48 of the first 75 Vone 2nd they encountered, a 64% success rate. With the V-1 threat largely mitigated, the port of Antwerp remained open for the duration of the war. By the end of the campaign, anti-aircraft units equipped with proximity fuses had destroyed more than 2,000 Vone 2nd targeting Antwerp and London combined. On October 25, 1944, the combined Chiefs of Staff authorized general use of proximity fuses over land for anti-aircraft defense, formalizing what had become standard practice across the European theater. But ground artillery still could not use proximity fuses against enemy troops. Army artillery officers were furious. They knew proximity fuses would be devastatingly effective against ground targets. A conventional artillery shell detonated on impact with the ground, which meant that troops in trenches, foxholes, or behind cover were protected. But a shell that detonated in the air above them would spray shrapnel downward into their positions. Trenches became death traps. Foxholes offered no safety. Even log-reinforced bunkers could be penetrated by high-velocity fragments. Proximity-fused artillery would multiply the lethality of American firepower many times over. But the Pentagon held firm. The risk of a dud shell falling into German hands was still considered too high. Army artillery would have to wait. Then, at 05:30 on December 16, 1944, Germany launched Operation Watch on the Rhine. 3 German armies attacked through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, hitting thinly held American positions with overwhelming force. The attack achieved complete surprise. German armor punched through American lines and began driving west toward the Meuse River and the Belgian port of Antwerp. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and American forces were in serious trouble. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson made his decision within minutes. His 406th Field Artillery Group had just received shipments of posite shells, the Army code name for proximity-fused artillery rounds. When the 38th Cavalry Squadron called for fire support, Axelson knew conventional shells would have limited effectiveness against German infantry advancing through forested terrain. But proximity-fused shells detonating above the trees would kill anything in the open. He ordered his gunners to load posite and fire. The effect was immediate and devastating. German infantry caught in the barrage were cut down by airbursts they never saw coming. The attack on the 38th Cavalry Squadron collapsed. 3 days later, on December 19th, General Dwight Eisenhower formally requested authorization to use proximity-fused artillery shells across the entire European theater. The German offensive was the largest attack the US Army had ever faced. Every advantage mattered. On December 21st, all restrictions were lifted. Proximity-fused artillery shells were released for general use. The timing was critical. SS Colonel Otto Skorzény's troops were attacking the town of Malmedy. American artillery battalions supporting Malmedy fired proximity fuses with devastating effect. The attacking German soldiers found themselves caught in airbursts that detonated overhead with no warning. Some Germans charged directly into the artillery. Fire, hands raised, screaming Kamerad, the German word for comrade, trying to surrender. By December 23rd, estimates suggested as many as 2,000 German soldiers had been killed by proximity-fused artillery shells in just the first few days of their use. The Germans quickly realized they were facing a new type of weapon. Prisoners of war repeatedly described the demoralizing effect of artillery shells that exploded in the air above them with perfect timing. Traditional artillery gave soldiers a brief moment of hope. They would hear the whistle of incoming shells and dive for cover. If they were in a trench or foxhole, they might survive even a direct hit nearby because the explosion was on the surface. But proximity-fused shells detonated 30 to 50 feet in the air directly above defensive positions. There was no cover. There was no warning. The shells arrived silently at high velocity and detonated overhead, raining shrapnel straight down. Soldiers who had felt safe and in prepared defensive positions were being killed without ever seeing the threat. The psychological impact was severe. German commanders offered rewards for any soldier who could recover an intact proximity fuse. They needed to understand how the weapon worked so they could develop countermeasures or copy the technology. In late December 1944, German forces captured an American ammunition dump that contained 20,000 proximity-fused artillery shells. German engineers examined the fuses carefully. They recognized sophisticated electronics were involved, but they could not understand how the technology worked. Most critically, German engineers could not believe that miniature vacuum tubes could survive the acceleration forces of artillery gun firing. Their own research had convinced them such tubes were impossible to manufacture. They assumed the captured fuses were defective or designed for a different application. They never realized what they were looking at. The time German scientists understood the significance of proximity fuses, the war was nearly over, and Germany had no industrial capacity left to develop countermeasures. On the night of December 25th and 26, 1944, General George Patton's Third Army caught a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River near Echternach, Luxembourg. American artillery units fired a concentrated barrage using proximity-fused shells. The shells detonated above the river, and the German troops massed on the banks. There was no cover on the riverbank, no place to hide. The German soldiers were completely exposed in the open. Patton wrote a letter to the War Department describing the result. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion which was trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad that you all thought of it first." 702 confirmed German dead in a single artillery barrage. That was unprecedented lethality. Conventional artillery shells might have killed 50 or 60 soldiers under similar circumstances. The proximity fuse had multiplied the effectiveness of American artillery by more than 10 times. And this was not an isolated incident. Throughout the Battle of the Bulge, proximity-fused artillery devastated German formations caught in the open. In the Hürtgen forest, an American chief ordnance officer reported finding 96 bodies from a German patrol hit by a massed proximity-fused artillery barrage. "The bodies looked as if they had gone through a meat grinder," he wrote in his report. "The high-velocity artillery shells arrived too quickly for German soldiers to hear them coming. The air bursts detonated with no warning. Foxholes provided no protection. The shrapnel even penetrated log-reinforced bunkers that would have stopped conventional artillery. German units that tried to advance through artillery fire were annihilated. German commanders reported that their soldiers were refusing orders to move forward because they knew proximity-fused artillery could kill them even in covered positions. Prisoners of war interviewed after capture described being in a dazed state after surviving proximity-fused barrages. They realized they were facing a new kind of artillery, but could not understand how it worked or how to evade it. Minor mutinies broke out among German units that were ordered into areas known to be covered by American artillery. Some German soldiers simply refused to leave their bunkers when proximity-fused artillery was falling. The Germans had felt safe from traditional timed artillery because heavy overcast weather prevented accurate aerial observation. American forward observers could not see German positions clearly, which meant timed artillery shells would be set based on estimates that were often inaccurate. German troops had learned to take cover whenever they heard artillery fire and wait for the barrage to end. But proximity-fused shells did not require accurate observation. The fuses automatically detonated at the optimal height above ground regardless of weather conditions or visibility. American gunners just needed to know the approximate location of German forces and fire. The proximity fuses did the rest. The bad weather that had protected German forces now meant nothing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By late January 1945, German resistance in the Ardennes had collapsed. The Battle of the Bulge was over. American forces had stopped the largest German offensive of the war and were preparing to cross the Rhine River into Germany. Proximity-fused artillery had played a critical role in that victory. General Patton later stated that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. While that was an overstatement, the proximity fuse had undeniably changed the tactical situation. German forces that would have been able to defend prepared positions effectively against conventional artillery were wiped out by airbursts they could not avoid. In the Pacific theatre, the proximity fuse had an even more dramatic impact. By 1945, Japanese forces had adopted kamikaze tactics, using suicide aircraft loaded with explosives to attack American ships. These attacks were extremely difficult to defend against because conventional anti-aircraft fire required direct hits on aircraft that were deliberately trying to crash into ships at close range. Kamikaze pilots often approached at wave-top altitude, making visual detection difficult. They would then pull up sharply for their final dive, giving gunners only seconds to engage. But proximity-fused shells created a defensive barrier around ships that was almost impossible for kamikaze aircraft to penetrate. The shells did not require direct hits. A near miss was as lethal as a direct hit. Navy studies showed that ships using proximity-fused ammunition were 5 to 10 times more effective at stopping kamikaze attacks than ships using conventional time-fused shells. Ships equipped with 5-inch 38 caliber guns firing proximity-fused ammunition could create a lethal zone extending thousands of yards from the ship. Any aircraft entering that zone faced a statistical probability of destruction that approached certainty. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded destroyers in the Solomon Islands campaign in 1942 and 1943, later wrote about the difficulties of defending against Japanese air attacks, especially after dark. Mechanical time fuses, which we had been using, only brought down a plane at night by accident, he recalled. They were good for harassing enemy aircraft at night, but that was about all. The proximity fuse changed everything by making nighttime air defense genuinely effective for the first time. In the 7 months from January to July 1945, American ships expended nearly 2/3 of all proximity fuses used during the entire war, shooting down more than 200 aircraft. The proximity fuse allowed the Navy to maintain operations in waters where kamikaze attacks would otherwise have made naval operations suicidally dangerous. The effectiveness of proximity fuses went beyond simple statistics. The psychological impact on enemy forces was significant. Japanese pilots knew that approaching American ships equipped with proximity-fused anti-aircraft guns meant flying into an invisible sphere of death. The shells did not need to hit them directly. They just needed to pass nearby and detonate. There was no way to evade this defense. Japanese pilots reported feeling helpless against weapons that seemed to anticipate their maneuvers. Some historians have suggested that the proximity fuse was one factor that pushed Japan toward kamikaze tactics. If conventional attack methods could not penetrate American defenses, suicide attacks might be the only option. The proximity fuse demonstrated a pattern that would repeat throughout World War II and beyond. Technological advantage in warfare does not come primarily from theoretical breakthroughs. It comes from engineering, execution, and manufacturing scale. The concept of a proximity fuse was well understood by multiple nations before the war began. What separated success from failure was the ability to solve thousands of small engineering problems, manufacture components to precise tolerances, and produce complex electronic devices in quantities of millions while maintaining quality control. The United States had the industrial base, the skilled workforce, and the organizational structure that could coordinate work across dozens of contractors. Germany and Japan did not. By 1944, American industry was producing more proximity fuses every month than Germany and Japan had produced artillery shells of all types combined. General George Patton had been correct when he wrote that armies would need to devise new methods of warfare once proximity-fused artillery became widespread. The assumption that soldiers in trenches or foxholes were safe from artillery fire had been fundamental to military tactics since World War I. The proximity fuse shattered that assumption. Defensive positions that had been considered adequate protection against artillery were now death traps. Armies would need to disperse more widely, dig deeper fortifications, and move faster to avoid artillery barrages. The tactical changes forced by proximity-fused artillery rippled through military doctrine for decades. Section T operated on an accelerated timeline that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. From the initial assignment in August 1940 to the first, combat use in January 1943 was less than 2.5 years. During that time, Tuve's team had solved problems that had stumped scientists in multiple countries for more than a decade. They had developed miniature ruggedized vacuum tubes that could survive forces no civilian electronics had ever faced. They had designed circuits that operated reliably under conditions of extreme vibration, temperature variation, and electromagnetic interference. They had created manufacturing processes that could produce complex electronic devices at scales previously thought impossible. And they had done all of this while maintaining absolute secrecy that prevented enemy intelligence from learning what they were building. Dr. Merle Tuve never received public recognition for leading the development of the proximity fuse during the war. The project remained classified until after Japan surrendered. Even after the war ended, Tuve was reluctant to discuss his role. He understood that Section T had solved an engineering problem that saved thousands of Allied lives, but he also knew that many people at many organizations had contributed to that success. The proximity fuse was not the work of a single genius. It was the product of systematic collaboration between physicists, engineers, manufacturers, and military personnel across dozens of organizations. Over 22 million proximity fuses were produced during World War II by more than 100 manufacturers. That scale of production required contributions from thousands of people, most of whom never knew what they were building. After the war, Tuve returned to the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution and served as its director from 1946 to 1966. He continued research in geophysics and radio astronomy. In 1948, he was named an honorary commander of the Order of the British Empire for his service to the Allied cause during the war. President Harry Truman awarded him the Presidential Medal for Merit, but Tuve rarely spoke about the proximity fuse. When asked about his wartime work, he emphasized the collaborative nature of the project and the contributions of the engineers and technicians who had solved countless technical problems that made mass production possible. Dr. Merle Tuve died on May 20, 1982, at the age of 80. His obituaries mentioned his contributions to geophysics and his leadership of the Applied Physics Laboratory during World War II, but most did not detail the specific work he had done on proximity fuses. The technology had been declassified for decades, but it remained obscure outside military and technical circles. Tuve himself had never sought publicity for his wartime work. He believed that scientific achievement should be measured by results, not recognition. The proximity fuse had saved lives and helped win the war. That was what mattered. The Applied Physics laboratory that Tuve founded continues to operate today as a research facility of Johns Hopkins University. It conducts work in national security, space exploration, and advanced technology development. The building in Silver Spring, Maryland, where Section T first assembled proximity fuses in 1942, no longer stands. It was demolished decades ago and replaced by commercial development. There is no memorial marker at the site. Nothing identifies it as the place where one of the war's most important technologies was born. The workers who assembled proximity fuses in factories across America went back to their peacetime jobs when the war ended. Most never learned exactly what they had been building. The soldiers and sailors who benefited from proximity-fused ammunition rarely knew the technical details of how the fuses worked. They just knew that anti-aircraft guns were suddenly much more effective and artillery barrages were far more lethal. The technology remained mysterious even to the people whose lives it saved. The 702 German soldiers killed by proximity-fused artillery on the banks of the Sauer River in December 1944 were buried in military cemeteries in Luxembourg and Germany. Their graves do not mention how they died. The military records list them as killed in action by artillery fire, which was true but incomplete. They were among the first ground troops anywhere to be killed by a technology that their own scientists had declared impossible. They died not knowing that the shells exploding above them contained miniature radar sets more sophisticated than anything Germany had been able to build. They died not knowing that American factories were producing these shells by the hundreds of thousands, while German industry struggled to manufacture basic artillery ammunition. The German engineers who had declared proximity fuses impossible never understood what they had missed. After the war, American technical intelligence teams interrogated German scientists and showed them captured German documents detailing their proximity fuse research. The Germans had explored most of the same technical approaches that Section T had used. They had considered radio frequency fuses, vacuum tube designs, and miniaturization techniques. But they had concluded that the engineering challenges could not be overcome with existing technology. What separated the American project from the German project was not a difference in scientific knowledge, but a difference in engineering persistence and manufacturing capability. American industry could produce miniature ruggedized vacuum tubes in quantities of millions. American engineers could iterate through dozens of design failures until they found solutions that worked. Germany lacked the industrial base and the time to compete on those terms. This is how wars are actually won. Not through dramatic breakthroughs or genius inventors working in isolation, but through systematic collaboration between scientists, engineers, manufacturers, and military personnel. The proximity fuse succeeded because Section T could draw on the resources of American industry, the technical expertise of academic researchers, and the practical knowledge of Navy ordnance officers who understood what combat conditions would demand. It succeeded because Western Electric and Raytheon could manufacture ruggedized vacuum tubes that no one had built before. It succeeded because factory workers across America could assemble complex electronics at scales that would have been impossible for any other nation. And it succeeded because Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson made the decision to use the technology when it mattered most, even though he was violating direct orders by doing so. The story of the proximity fuse is the story of American industrial and scientific power at its peak. It is the story of what becomes possible when brilliant people are given clear objectives, adequate resources, and freedom from bureaucratic constraints. It is the story of innovation that happens not through individual genius, but through systematic problem-solving at scale. And it is the story of a technology that saved thousands of Allied lives and changed warfare forever, developed by people whose names are mostly forgotten today. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.